Story title: The Divided Nation, the story of Abraham Lincoln's leadership. Chapter 1: The Rise of a Self-Made Man. 1.1 Early Life in Poverty. Abraham Lincoln was born on February 12, 1809, in a one-room log cabin on the frontier of Hardin County, Kentucky. The Lincoln family lived in dire poverty, constantly moving in search of land that could provide them with a stable home. His mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, passed away when he was just 9 years old, leaving a young Abraham to be raised by his stepmother. Lincoln's father, Thomas, was a hard-working man but lacked the resources to send Abraham to school. Despite this, Lincoln was determined to educate himself. He borrowed books from neighbors, read by firelight, and absorbed everything he could. His love for reading became the foundation of his future. He would later credit his education in law and public speaking to these early years of self-teaching. This humble upbringing, coupled with a deep sense of perseverance, defined Lincoln's character for the rest of his life. 1.2 The Call to Law. By the age of 21, Lincoln had moved to New Salem, Illinois, where he worked as a storekeeper, rail splitter, and postmaster. It was here that he decided to pursue a career in law. Lincoln's interest in the law was sparked by his exposure to the legal documents he encountered in his work and his growing fascination with the power of words. He taught himself legal principles, borrowing law books from neighbors, and within a few years, he was ready to take the bar exam. In 1836, at the age of 27, he passed the exam and became a lawyer. Lincoln's legal career was marked by his honesty, intelligence, and unique ability to connect with ordinary people. His reputation for fairness and his skills in delivering persuasive speeches earned him respect in his community. Lincoln was no longer just a self-taught frontiersman, he was becoming a prominent figure in Illinois. 1.3 Political Beginnings. Lincoln's legal success didn't keep him from entering the political arena. In 1834, he ran for the Illinois state legislature and won. His early political career was characterized by a strong opposition to the expansion of slavery into new territories. Lincoln's views on slavery were influenced by the growing tension between the North and South over the issue. In his early speeches, Lincoln expressed his belief in the moral wrongness of slavery, but he did not yet advocate for its immediate abolition. Instead, he argued that slavery should not be allowed to spread further into the Western territories. Over the next few years, Lincoln became known for his sharp mind and principled stands on issues of national importance, particularly regarding slavery and the Union. These early experiences in the political world gave him the tools he would need to navigate the deeply divided country during his presidency. Chapter 2: The Nation in Turmoil. 2.1 Election of 1860. The 1860 presidential election was one of the most pivotal in American history. As the country became more divided over slavery, the Democratic Party split into two factions. The Republican Party, which was relatively new, nominated Abraham Lincoln as its candidate. Lincoln's platform called for the prevention of slavery's expansion into the Western territories, which was strongly opposed by the South. Despite winning the Republican nomination, Lincoln faced significant opposition from the Southern states, where the prospect of his election sent shockwaves through the population. Many Southern leaders declared that if Lincoln won, they would secede from the Union. When Lincoln won the election in November 1860, with less than 40% of the popular vote, the South saw it as a threat to their way of life. 2.2 Secession of the South. After Lincoln's election, the Southern states began to act on their threats. South Carolina was the first to secede in December 1860, followed by Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. These states formed the Confederacy, with Jefferson Davis as their president. The secession of the Southern states was a direct response to Lincoln's election and his opposition to the spread of slavery. The Confederacy was built on the belief that each state had the right to govern itself, including the right to maintain the institution of slavery. The Union, however, viewed the secession as an unlawful rebellion. Lincoln believed the Union must be preserved at all costs, and he made it clear in his speeches that he would not allow the Southern states to break away without a fight. The nation stood on the brink of war, with the South determined to defend its way of life and the North committed to preserving the Union. 2.3 Lincoln's First Inaugural Address. Lincoln's first inaugural address, delivered on March 4, 1861, was an effort to calm the tensions between the North and South. In his speech, Lincoln assured the Southern states that he had no intention of interfering with slavery where it already existed. 2.4 The Outbreak of the Civil War. The Civil War began in earnest on April 12, 1861, when Confederate forces attacked the Union garrison at Fort Sumter, South Carolina. The Union had sent reinforcements to the fort, and when the Confederates fired upon it, Lincoln had no choice but to call for troops to defend the Union. In response to the attack, Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to join the army and quell the rebellion. This marked the beginning of the Civil War. The Confederacy, led by President Jefferson Davis, had already made plans to resist the Union's efforts to maintain control over the southern states. The Union, under Lincoln's leadership, quickly mobilized its forces to put down the rebellion. The war that followed would prove to be long, brutal, and transformative, as Lincoln fought to preserve the Union and end the practice of slavery. Chapter 3. The War Begins. 3.1 Early Struggles. The first few years of the Civil War were marked by a series of Union defeats. The Confederacy, under General Robert E. Lee and other skilled commanders, won several important battles. The Battle of Bull Run in July 1861 was a major blow to the Union Army. The battle, which was expected to be an easy victory for the North, ended in a humiliating defeat. The Confederate victory boosted Southern morale and showed the Union that the war would not be easily won. Despite the early setbacks, Lincoln remained committed to the cause of preserving the Union. When he made the difficult decision to replace several generals who had failed to deliver victories, a move that led to the appointment of General 3.2 Lincoln's leadership. Throughout the early years of the war, Lincoln displayed remarkable leadership. Despite the growing pressures of the conflict, he had to manage not only the military situation, but also the politics of a deeply divided nation. His administration faced increasing criticism from both the North and the South. Some believed Lincoln was too lenient, while others felt he was too harsh. Despite this, Lincoln was resolute in his belief that the Union must be preserved at all costs. He worked tirelessly to ensure that the Union had the resources it needed to fight the war and to rally support among the American people. His ability to communicate with the public through speeches and letters helped keep morale high in the North. 3.3 The First Battle of Bull Run. The Battle of Bull Run, also known as the Battle of Manassas, was the first major battle of the Civil War, and it took place in July 1861. The Union Army, led by General Irvin McDowell, marched toward the Confederate capital of Richmond, expecting to crush the Confederate forces. However, the battle turned into a disaster for the Union. The Confederate Army, under General P.G.T. Beauregard and General Joseph E. Johnston, launched a surprise counterattack, forcing the Union forces to retreat. The defeat shocked the Northern public, and many in the Union began to question whether the war could be won. 3.4 Lincoln's Resolve. Despite the early losses, Lincoln remained resolute. He understood that the preservation of the Union was paramount, and he was willing to make difficult decisions to achieve that goal. Lincoln's resolve was tested by the ongoing military setbacks and the growing political opposition to the war, but he was determined to see it through. He recognized that the war was not just about defeating the Confederacy, but about fundamentally changing the future of the United States. As the war dragged on, Lincoln began to shift his focus toward the abolition of slavery, understanding that it was integral to the war effort and to the future of the nation. His leadership during this time showed that he was not just a politician, but a man of vision who understood the gravity of the moment. Chapter 4. The Emancipation Proclamation. 4.1 The Shift in Focus. As the Civil War raged on, the moral imperative of ending slavery grew ever clearer to Abraham Lincoln. Early in the war, Lincoln had been careful not to make slavery a central issue, focusing instead on preserving the Union. However, by 1862, it was evident that the war could not be won without addressing slavery. Lincoln came to believe that slavery was not only a moral wrong, but also an obstacle to the Union's victory. He realized that freeing the slaves in the southern states would undermine the Confederate economy, which relied heavily on slavery. Additionally, it would weaken the Confederate resolve, as the enslaved population would likely rise up or escape to Union lines. The idea of emancipation began to take shape, but Lincoln hesitated. 4.2 The Proclamation Draft. Lincoln spent months carefully drafting the Emancipation Proclamation. He consulted with his cabinet, military leaders, and advisors, knowing that the document would change the course of the war. Lincoln's own moral convictions about slavery were tempered. by the pragmatic realities of the war. He needed a policy that would unite the Union behind the war effort, while also striking a blow to the Confederacy. On September 22, 1862, after the Union victory at the Battle of Antietam, Lincoln issued a preliminary version of the proclamation, setting January 1, 1863, as the date when it would take effect. 4.3 The reaction. The Emancipation Proclamation was met with mixed reactions. In the North, it was hailed as a moral victory and a necessary step toward ending slavery. Many abolitionists, including Frederick Douglass, praised Lincoln for taking such a bold step. However, others were wary of the proclamation's potential to alienate the border states and Northern Democrats, who were still sympathetic to slavery in certain regions. In the South, the reaction was one of defiance. The Confederacy rejected the proclamation, claiming that it was an overreach of federal power. Enslaved people, however, saw the proclamation as a beacon of hope. The proclamation also opened the door for the recruitment of black soldiers into the Union Army, with over 180,000 African Americans serving in the military by the end of the war. 4. The long-term impact. The Emancipation Proclamation fundamentally changed the nature of the Civil War. It made the abolition of slavery a key goal of the Union war effort, alongside the preservation of the Union itself. The proclamation also paved the way for the passage of the 13th Amendment, which would permanently abolish slavery in the United States. Lincoln's decision was controversial and difficult, but it ultimately became one of his most enduring legacies. The proclamation transformed the war from a battle to save the Union into a fight for human freedom. It was a significant step in the long journey toward racial equality in America, though the struggle for civil rights would continue long after the war's end. Chapter 5. The Battle for Union Victory. 5.1 The Siege of Vicksburg. In 1863, the Union Army, under General Ulysses S. Grant, launched a critical campaign to capture the Confederate stronghold of Vicksburg, Mississippi. Vicksburg was strategically located on the Mississippi River, and controlling it would give the Union Army a critical advantage by cutting the Confederacy in two. The campaign was long and grueling, as the Union forces laid siege to the city for several months. The Confederates, led by General John C. Pemberton, put up fierce resistance, but the Union forces eventually succeeded. On July 4, 1863, Vicksburg surrendered, and the Union gained control of the Mississippi River. This victory was a turning point in the war, as it split the Confederacy and gave the Union Army a much-needed morale boost. 5.2 The Battle of Gettysburg. The Battle of Gettysburg, fought from July 1 to July 3, 1863, was one of the most pivotal moments of the Civil War. Confederate General Robert E. Lee, confident after victories in the East, decided to invade the North and bring the war to Union soil. The Union Army, commanded by General George G. Meade, met Lee's forces at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Over 3 days of intense fighting, the Union Army successfully repelled Lee's forces, inflicting heavy casualties on the Confederates. The battle was a decisive victory for the Union, halting Lee's invasion and turning the tide of the war. The Union's success at Gettysburg, coupled with the victory at Vicksburg, marked the high point of Union military fortunes. 3 Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. Just a few months after the Battle of Gettysburg, on November 19, 1863, Lincoln delivered what would become one of his most famous speeches, the Gettysburg Address, delivered at the dedication of a national cemetery for Union soldiers who had fallen in the battle. Lincoln's speech redefined the purpose of the war. He spoke of the nation's founding principles, stating that the United States was dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Lincoln framed the war as a test of whether a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal could endure. The speech was short but profound, and its impact was immediate. It reminded the American people that the war was not just about preserving 5.4, a new strategy for victory. Following the victories at Vicksburg and Gettysburg, Lincoln recognized that the war could be won, but it would require continued military pressure on the Confederacy. He continued to support General Grant, who had demonstrated a willingness to engage the enemy in relentless, direct combat. Grant's strategy was to press the Confederacy from multiple directions, exhausting their resources and weakening their ability to resist. The war would become a test of endurance for both sides. Lincoln, despite growing frustration and criticism from some quarters, remained committed to Grant's approach. Chapter 6, The Election of 1864. 6.1, The Political Landscape. As the Civil War continued into 1864, public opinion was divided. While many in the North were committed to preserving the Union, others were weary of the ongoing conflict and its heavy toll in lives and resources. The Democratic Party, which was divided on the issue of slavery, nominated George B. McClellan, the former Union general, as their candidate. McClellan ran on a platform calling for a negotiated peace with the Confederacy. This message resonated with war-weary Northerners who longed for an end to the bloodshed. Lincoln, however, believed that negotiating peace with the Confederacy would be a betrayal of the Union cause and the principles of freedom. He sought re-election, despite knowing that the outcome of the war remained uncertain. 6.2, Lincoln's re-election campaign. Lincoln's re-election campaign was fraught with challenges. He faced opposition from within his own party, with some Republicans criticizing him for his handling of the war. Furthermore, many believed that his support for the abolition of slavery was too radical, and that peace with the Confederacy should be pursued. Despite these challenges, Lincoln remained focused on his vision for the country. He used his leadership and moral authority to rally support for the war effort, emphasizing the need to finish what had been started. He also promised that the Union would be preserved and that slavery would be abolished. Lincoln's leadership on these issues resonated with many Americans, and his message of perseverance and hope won the day. 6-3, The election outcome. In November 1864, despite the continuing hardships of war, Lincoln was re-elected by a decisive margin. His victory was in part due to a resurgence of Northern support following the Union victories at Atlanta and Mobile Bay. His victory was also due to his moral clarity on the issue of slavery and his determination to preserve the Union. His re-election marked a turning point in the war, as it ensured that the Union's commitment to victory would continue. Lincoln's win also signaled the importance of maintaining political unity in the North, even as the war continued to exact a heavy toll. 6.4, The final stages of war. With his re-election, Lincoln continued to press forward with the war effort. He worked closely with General Grant, who was becoming more successful in his campaigns. The Confederacy, exhausted and depleted, was nearing collapse. Lincoln's focus remained on achieving total victory, though he was also beginning to consider the post-war reconstruction of the nation. He had a vision for a united, rebuilt America, one that would welcome the Southern states back into the Union and offer freedom to all of its citizens. Lincoln's vision for the nation's future would ultimately be realized. But the cost of the war, both in lives and in the deep divisions it caused, was immeasurable. Chapter 7, The Fall of the Confederacy. 7.1, The Confederate Decline. By the spring of 1865, the Confederate States of America were in their final stages of collapse. The Union Army, under the leadership of General Ulysses S. Grant, had successfully worn down the Confederate forces through a series of brutal campaigns. Grant's strategy of relentless pursuit, particularly the Overland Campaign and the Siege of Petersburg, had effectively crippled the South's ability to continue fighting. The Confederate economy, which had relied heavily on agriculture and slavery, was in tatters. Southern infrastructure had been destroyed, and the Confederate Army was severely outnumbered and outgunned. The South's ability to wage war was rapidly diminishing, and it was clear that the Confederacy could not survive much longer. 7.2, General Lee's surrender at Appomattox. The final blow to the Confederate cause came in April 1865, when General Robert E. Lee, commander of the Army of Northern Virginia, was forced to surrender to General Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. After months of exhausting retreat and battle, Lee realized that further resistance would be futile. On April 9, 1865, Lee and Grant met in a small, modest home in Appomattox Courthouse, where the terms of surrender were negotiated. Grant, ever the pragmatic leader, offered generous terms to Lee's men. The Confederate soldiers would be allowed to return home with their horses and personal belongings, and they would not face prosecution for their role in the rebellion. This act of mercy from Grant reflected his understanding that healing the nation would require not just military victory, but also compassion and reconciliation. 7.3, Lincoln's vision for Reconstruction. As the Confederacy collapsed, President Lincoln began to turn his attention to the task of reconstruction, restoring the Southern states to the Union and rebuilding a nation torn apart by war. Lincoln's vision for Reconstruction was one of healing and reconciliation, not retribution. He proposed the 10% plan, which would allow Southern states to re-enter the Union if 10% of their voters swore an oath of loyalty to the Union. 7.4 The assassination of Abraham Lincoln. Just days after General Lee's surrender at Appomattox, tragedy struck the nation. On the evening of April 14, 1865, President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth, a Confederate sympathizer. While attending a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. Lincoln's death sent shockwaves throughout the nation, leaving the country in mourning. The assassination was not just a personal tragedy for Lincoln's family, but a profound loss for the nation. Lincoln had guided the Union through its darkest hours, and his death left a void in leadership that would prove difficult to fill. Vice President Andrew Johnson, a Southern Democrat who had remained loyal to the Union, became president but lacked Lincoln's vision and political skill. Chapter 8. The Aftermath of the Civil War. 8.1 The Nation in Mourning. The assassination of President Lincoln was a devastating blow to a nation already reeling from the horrors of war. Across the United States, citizens mourned the loss of their leader, who had steered the nation through its most difficult crisis. The public reaction was one of shock and grief, with many seeing Lincoln as the savior of the Union and the champion of emancipation. As news of his death spread, people gathered in churches, town squares, and homes to honor the fallen president. Lincoln's funeral procession, which stretched from Washington, D.C. to Springfield, Illinois, was attended by thousands of mourners. The funeral became a symbol of national unity, as people from all walks of life paid their respects to the man who had led the nation through the Civil War. 8.2 The Challenges of Reconstruction. With Lincoln's assassination, the task of reconstruction fell to Andrew Johnson, who lacked the political acumen and the moral clarity that Lincoln had exhibited. Johnson's approach to Reconstruction was far less conciliatory and more lenient toward the South. His policies allowed many former Confederates to regain control of Southern state governments, which angered many in the North, particularly the radical Republicans. These Republicans pushed for stronger protections for the newly freed slaves and more stringent requirements for Southern states to rejoin the Union. The struggle over how best to rebuild the South led to a fierce political battle in Washington. 8.3 The passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Despite the challenges of Reconstruction, progress was made in securing rights for African Americans. The 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, was passed by Congress in 1865 and ratified by the states later that year. The 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868, granted citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the United States, including formerly enslaved people. It also provided equal protection under the law, guaranteeing that no state could deprive any citizen of life, liberty, or property without due process. Finally, the 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, gave African American men the right to vote, ensuring that the former slaves could participate in the political life of the nation. 8.4 The rise of the Ku Klux Klan. In response to the newfound freedom of African Americans, many white Southerners reacted with violent resistance. The Ku Klux Klan, KKK, emerged as a powerful and terrifying force during Reconstruction, using intimidation, violence, and terror to suppress African American political and civil rights. The Klan targeted freedmen, as well as white Republicans and Northern sympathizers, in an effort to reassert white supremacy in the South. The federal government attempted to combat the Klan through legislation and military intervention, but the group continued to operate in secret, undermining efforts at racial equality.